So I finally decided to try out Anthem this year purely out of curiosity. And in today's video we'll be looking at whether the experience was worth it and whether you should either buy it or reinstall it in 2023. Now, to get everyone up to speed, Anthem was BioWare's much anticipated title after the messy launch of Mass Effect Andromeda, and it was supposed to be the IP that would breathe new life into the Canadian-based, now EA-owned studio, and it was supposed to become a serious competitor to games such as Destiny and Warframe, games that have become titans in the looter-shooter genre. However, due to several reasons, some that we will be exploring in today's video, Anthem turned out to be an even bigger catastrophe than that of Mass Effect Andromeda. And so, now that you have a small insight into Anthem's background, let's suit up and blast off, shall we? First and foremost, in Anthem you play as an unnamed freelancer. And well, you're essentially a mercenary for hire living in a place called Fort Tarsis, and together with your trusty mechanized suit, dubbed the Javelin, you complete missions out in the dangerous jungle of the fictional planet of Coda. Now, for the good stuff. The intro for Anthem throws you into a big event that serves as sort of a backstory to your character, and the overall presentation in the beginning minutes of the game is actually pretty badass, as the game showcases its graphical fidelity while also teaching you how to maneuver your Javelin. I'm not gonna lie, just like Mass Effect Andromeda, Anthem's environments are absolutely gorgeous, and again, we see that environments are truly where the Frostbite engine is at its strongest, and thankfully, the starting hours of Anthem was pretty stable performance-wise, even when running the game at ultra settings with 1440p resolution. Now, yes, I'm using an RTX 2080 graphics card, but since my card is a couple of years old by this point, I was still genuinely surprised at how well Anthem ran on my PC. Again, at the start of the game. I'll get back to that later. Another thing that I like is the fairly simplistic UI. It's easy to scroll through with simple menus, and there are quite a few settings you can mess around with to customize your game. Of course, the strongest selling point for Anthem are the Javelins, the different mechanized suits that you'll be using throughout the game. And to put it bluntly, the Javelins are pretty much customizable Iron Man suits with different strengths and abilities. And whenever you're not in the main hub of Fort Tarsis, you'll be out exploring and completing missions in your Javelin. Now, right from the get-go, it has to be said that BioWare really nailed most of the gameplay surrounding the Javelins. If you've ever just wanted to play an Iron Man game that makes you feel just as powerful as Iron Man while also having great flight mechanics, well then Anthem's Javelins are probably the closest you're going to get. While all of the 4 Javelin types control mostly the same, they all feel distinctly different, both in terms of actual gameplay but also in how they feel. Examples here is the Colossus, that's basically a walking tank. And then we have my personal favorite, for reasons that should be quite obvious,
Yeah, boy.
the Interceptor, which is basically the opposite of the Colossus, being a quick and nimble suit that you can use to dart across the battlefield. Every Javelin also has its ultimate ability that you can deploy after you've built up your meter, and all of the ultimates feel fittingly powerful for each Javelin. Now, at the end of the day, Anthem is a looter-shooter, meaning that most of the mechanics of the game is built around a similar style to like that of Destiny, which again is the prime inspiration for Anthem. Aside from playing through the main story, you'll be completing missions, clearing dungeons, and wiping out hordes upon hordes of enemies, all in order to collect better and better loot, this mostly being equipment to make your Javelin stronger. And like I mentioned earlier, this gameplay loop is pretty fun in the beginning hours of the game, and most of the items or reagents you find are valuable in some way. Okay, so at this point in the video, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, all of this sounds pretty good so far. I'm thinking I should try this game out. But hold up a minute, because it's time for us to get into the bad stuff about Anthem. First, we gotta talk about the story. Now, I'm not gonna say that the main campaign is terrible, but it's not great either. The best way I can sum up the main campaign is meh. What's so bad about this in particular is that Anthem was made by BioWare, a studio that, before Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem, was considered the top dog in making memorable stories for their games. Now, I'm not gonna spoil the main events of the game too much in case you choose to play it, but let's just say that I cannot remember a single character's name in this game. Or well, the main villain is called the Monitor, and just like your standard big evil villain, he has big evil plans to boot. But then, what of the motivations of everyone else? Well, there is this one weird dude that talks way too much during missions, and then there's the two old friends of the main character that's angry with you for reasons. Also, the dialogue is pretty lackluster most of the time, and unfortunately for me, my back almost broke from the sheer amount of cringe I felt through certain cutscenes and dialogue scenes.
I love Manticore.
Speaking of dialogue, I just gotta mention that yes, most of the NPCs in Anthem also suffer from the tired face syndrome, which we saw on full display throughout Mass Effect Andromeda. While it's definitely not as noticeable in Anthem, it still managed to throw me off several times, which resulted in me being unable to focus on whatever characters were saying because I couldn't stop thinking about how their facial movements didn't make sense with what they were saying. For the main character, I was horribly disappointed to see that Anthem's character creation section just lets you choose between a rather boring selection of pre-made appearances. Then again, since you're either in your Javelin or exploring Fort Tarsis in first person throughout the game, you never get to see your character anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. As most conversations will be held in the main hub, Fort Tarsis, I also gotta quickly mention that while the fort has a pretty unique look, its charm wears off pretty quickly. Having to trudge from one end of the hub to another just to pick up a quest got really annoying after a while, and because most conversations are really uninteresting in general, the static nature of the hub just slows the game down way too much. Speaking of the game slowing down, yes, the loading screens. There is a lot of loading between zones in this game, and despite having a pretty high-speed SSD, it still sometimes took minutes for me to load between zones. Now, loading between zones wouldn't have been too much of an issue if it wasn't for Anthem's regular connectivity issues. At one point I got disconnected several times as I was trying to finish one of the main story missions, which was pretty much game-breaking for a short while. Thankfully though, I could proceed with my playthrough after restarting Anthem a couple of times. Now, while I'd love to say that Anthem's performance stabilized after that, it unfortunately started feeling worse and worse as time went on. Partly because every time I entered into Fort Tarsis, the frames started dropping into a greater effect each time. Why? That's a good question, but at one point the performance just started getting so bad that I just couldn't force myself to keep playing. With all this said, is Anthem really that bad? Well, no, it's not that bad. To be completely frank with you, a lot of things in Anthem are great, like the javelins and the depth of the customization for said high-tech exosuits. The combat is mostly satisfying, and movement is really fluid, making exploration of the vast jungle a decent pastime. However, even this is probably going to get boring for you after a while, since guess what? This big jungle is the only biome there is, except for some of the different dungeons and raids. And because of that, even exploration gets tedious as you're just traveling around the same type of environment most of the time. Because of a mostly forgettable story, bland dialogue, uninteresting characters, a boring hub area, and a slew of technical issues, not to mention the lack of content after hitting level 30, what Anthem boils down to is essentially an at times fun, albeit forgettable looter-shooter. One that had tons of potential, had BioWare and EA just kept up by producing more content. And sadly, EA and BioWare officially shut down all production on Anthem in 2021, killing any hopes for future updates that could have made the game even better. So in conclusion, it's not worth it if you're looking for an overall amazing experience. But I would say that it is worth checking out at a heavy discount simply because of the javelins and the combat. But in all honesty, you probably shouldn't expect more than that. In any case, do remember to leave your thoughts down below, and as always, have a great day. MrHulthen signing out.